Hey, Stephen Regan here, DeKalb Asgrow Technical Agronomist, coming to you live from my garage, doing my part to socially distance ourselves during these uncertain times. So it's unfortunate we couldn't do a face-to-face meeting for the spring dealer agronomy training, but still want to do our best to provide the content to kind of set the stage for 2020 and be best prepared to service our customers as we get into the next growing season. So with the video today, my focus is soybean growth and development. And as I dive into that, it's all about what can we control in 2020, because we went through 2018, 2019, we went through some adverse, unfavorable conditions, and clearly that impacted some of our yields from things that were outside of our control. But I look back to Dr. Fred Below from University of Illinois and the 7 wonders of the corn world, the 6 secrets of soybean success. The number one factor for both crops is weather, so the number one yield limiting factor. But beyond that, when I look at soybeans from fertility down to seed treatment, ourselves, our customers are in control of those other aspects, and we got to maximize our potential from the things we can control, not knowing what the weather is going to do. So when I think about preparing for 2020, and our first step really is going to be planting, or the next phase that we're going to come into. A lot of times when we talk about planting, we're talking about corn, but when it comes to being precise and being detailed about our accuracy with planting, don't skip those details with soybeans, because seed bed preparation still matters. We want good seed to soil contact. Soil conditions still matter. We want moist seed bed, not overly saturated. Spacing makes a difference. I know soybeans can be forgiving, but even to that extent, if we can maximize spacing for soybeans, we can maximize yield potential per plant and hopefully elevate the yield potential on that farm. Depth control, we're looking at soybean seeding depth. We're looking at inch to inch and a half is really ideal. Try to keep that as even as possible. Then seed treatment, if we're going to take the step to plant the seed, put that investment in the ground, we got to protect it, because at planting we're at our maximum yield potential. Then along the way there's going to be things that affect us and lower that yield potential. But seed treatment can help protect that early on, put our best foot forward, protection from seedling diseases, some other pest pressures, disease pressures. So a soybean seed it's a miniature plant in itself, right? So really initiating that germination process, it has to start imbibing or taking in water, absorbing water. And it's got to absorb 50% of its weight in water to initiate this process, along with hitting kind of that mid-50 degree temperature requirement to begin the germination process. And once that germination process begins, we see the radicle extend down. That's going to be our main root there. The apicotyl begins to extend. The hypocotyl arch forms that crook that's going to carry the cotyledons up through the soil line. So as that begins, one thing I want to bring up is you see on social media and things where guys are planting soybeans on a really early planting date. Then you see an update video and they're like, oh, it's starting, we're making progress. Really, typically what that is, it's just starting to swell. It's absorbing water, and it's getting ready for the germination process, but it hasn't actually occurred. So that's one good thing to bring up. We still do need to hit that mid-50, 55 degree temperature to really get germination started. And that's fine for folks who want to try doing some of those early planting dates, trying to maximize yield potential from that. Just realize the risk exposure we're at from a standpoint of you're going to have a longer germination process, higher mortality rate, there's more risk for pest pressure, seedling diseases that can occur. So obviously seed treatments are critical in those scenarios, as well as I typically say we want to bump up that planting rate maybe 10 to 15% from where we're typically at, our average target rate. So if we're doing the ultra early, if we get into the season this year in 2020 where we have the opportunity in Minnesota to plant some pretty early planting dates when we're planting corn at the same time, just be mindful of how we manage that. Have a seed treatment on there. Make sure we're adjusting those planting rates to adjust for mortality. But beyond that, planting depth, we mentioned inch to inch and a half. The only time I see going deeper than that, if we're in really dry conditions, it may warrant going to 1 3/4 or 2 inches trying to get some moisture. But with soybeans, I would never plant deeper than 2 inches. Just keep that in mind. So when we talk about emergence, we said it could take a while depending on planting date, but in ideal conditions, it could take just a matter of 4 or 5 days to get out of the ground. If we're at that inch depth with good moisture and a good temperature, it's not going to take very long. The biggest thing about planting early and planting deep is being mindful of the cotyledons, because they are our warehouse for nutrients. So our cotyledons being these structures here, they provide nutrients for about 7 to 10 days from when germination begins to basically we start conducting enough photosynthesis. So between photosynthesis and the lateral roots begin to absorb water and nutrients, that's where our energy comes to keep the soybean plant growing. So we have to be mindful. That's why we don't plant too deep. That's why we try not to plant too early, because we need to make sure we get the soybeans out of the ground, get them developing, get photosynthesis occurring so we can keep that yield potential up. So when we talk about stages for soybeans, a lot of guys go, well, why do we need to talk about growth stages? With soybeans, the biggest factor here is it's looking at our opportunity for regrowth and what's going on at that point in time. Because unlike corn, corn, our growing point is below ground up until V5. With soybeans, our growing point is above ground as soon as emergence occurs. It's in between the cotyledons as they break through the soil surface, and then it's exposed from then on out. So this is our main growing point right here in between the unifoliates. This is the unifoliate stage or VC stage. There's one node present, so right here at this point in time, but there are 4 dormant growing points, and that's the important thing that I want to take away here, is every time that petiole comes to the junction of the stem or meets at the stem, that's a dormant growing point. So we have 2 dormant ones here, 2 dormant ones there. That's a good scenario to be in. You think about hail events, windstorms, other conditions that could occur that can impact our stand, our soybean stand. Well, if I'm cut off here, I still have dormant growing points that are going to be activated and cause regrowth. I still have a viable plant. If I'm cut off below the cotyledons, I'm out of luck, right? But when a customer calls and we have to go out and evaluate some scenarios like that, it's important to know what's our opportunity for regrowth. Do I have a viable plant or not? That helps us do a stand assessment to help make that decision. As we get into V1, not a lot's changed other than we now have a fully unrolled trifoliate. So there's 2 nodes, 1 trifoliate. We're at the V1 growth stage. We're going to get a new trifoliate about once a week, depending on growing conditions. If it's really productive growing conditions, it might be every 3, 4, 5 days. As things get cool and slow down, it may take up to a week and a half. So, at this standpoint, we're increasing our number of dormant growing points every time we add that trifoliate, so that's a good scenario to be in again for regrowth opportunities. Now when we get to V2, that's when things get a little more exciting. Not so much about what's going on above ground, but what's going on below ground. That's where all the activity is now. We're beginning to fix nitrogen, so the nodules are established, and it's an opportunity now where we can go check for proper nodulization. Especially if we did inoculate, say, looking at prevent plant acres from last year, perhaps we were worried about rhizobia bacteria, we inoculated, and go out there and check that we have active nodules, checking for that pink or red color of the tissue. And then, at this same point in time, we can be checking for soybean cyst nematodes, so if we're finding little white ovals attached to the roots as well, that we could find that we do have some cyst activity. But from V2, that's when fixation really begins. That's going to continue all the R5 roughly. The nodules started forming at emergence. They just don't become active until about this time frame. So with that being said, that's kind of a quick overview of soybean growth and development. We'll continue talking more about that as we get into the season, some of the later stages, especially the reproductive stages. But with that being said, other ways to keep up on some content, following any one of the TAs on Twitter as well as our regional pages for Minnesota. In season, I try to keep up to date with the DeKalb Minnesota West Snapchat. So if you're on Snapchat, I try to do things in field, whether it's disease pressure, things I'm seeing, things I want to highlight. And then obviously there's Facebook resource and aganytime.com. So encourage you to follow us on one of those platforms, as well as encourage you to get your customers following us on that as well. In the meantime, if there's any questions, please reach out, and